vast and endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean holds secrets that remain buried beneath its rolling waves and deep blue trenches. Sailors who have traversed these waters for generations speak in hushed tones about the things they have seen when the moon is hidden behind thick clouds. There are stories of ships that sail without crews and lights, that dance upon the water where no vessel should be. These are not merely tales to frighten young sailors, but are warnings passed down from captain to deckhand. The ocean is a graveyard of history, where the metal bones of war machines rest in eternal silence. But sometimes the dead do not sleep as soundly as we hope, and they seek to remind the living of their grim and violent demise in the cold water. It was late in the year of 1948 when a salvage tug named the Sea Raven ventured into a desolate sector of the Solomon Sea. The war had ended only a few years prior, but the scars of the conflict were still fresh upon the face of the world. The captain of the Sea Raven was a man named Elias Thorne, who had spent his entire life navigating the treacherous currents of the southern Pacific. Elias Thorne was a man of few words, and he commanded his crew with a stern gaze and a steady hand. He was not a man given to superstition or flights of fancy. Yet he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as they approached the coordinates. The air grew heavy and thick, with a humidity that felt unnatural. The mission was simple enough on paper, as they were tasked with locating the drifting wreck of a transport ship reported by a passing freighter. The salvage rights would make Elias Thorne and his crew wealthy men if they could tow the vessel back to port in Australia. However, the ocean in this particular region was known as Iron Bottom Sound, due to the sheer number of ships that had been sunk during the fierce naval battles of the previous war. The water here seemed darker than usual, as if it had absorbed the blood and oil of thousands of sailors. The crew of the Sea Raven stood on the deck and watched the horizon with uneasy eyes. The sun began to dip below the edge of the world and cast long shadows across the deck. As the last light of day faded from the sky, a thick and unnatural fog began to roll across the surface of the water. It did not move with the wind, but seemed to crawl under its own power. The fog was a pale and sickly gray color that swallowed the light of the stars and the moon. Elias Thorne stood in the wheelhouse and gripped the wooden wheel until his knuckles turned white. He ordered the engines to slow to a crawl as visibility dropped to less than 10 yards. The sound of the diesel engine chugging was the only noise in the oppressive silence. It felt as though the Sea Raven had sailed off the edge of the map and into a world where the laws of nature no longer applied. The radar operator was a young man named Thomas Vance, who stared intently at the glowing green screen of his instrument. He called out to the captain that he was picking up a large contact directly ahead of their position. The blip on the screen was massive and stationary, which suggested a vessel of considerable size drifting in the current. Elias Thorne peered into the swirling gray mist and tried to catch a glimpse of the ship. The air grew colder with each passing second, and the breath of the crew misted in front of their faces. This sudden drop in temperature was impossible in the tropical climate of the Solomon Islands. It was the chill of the grave reaching up from the depths to touch the living. Suddenly, the fog parted like a curtain, being drawn back by an invisible hand. Towering above them was the rusted and scarred hull of a destroyer-class warship from the United States Navy. The metal was pitted and corroded, as if it had been underwater for decades, rather than just drifting for a few years. Barnacles and seaweed clung to the waterline, and the gun turrets were twisted into grotesque shapes. There was no name visible on the bow, as the paint had long since peeled away to reveal the raw steel underneath. The ship listed heavily to the port side and looked as though it could capsize at any moment. It was a dead ship floating in a dead sea. Captain Elias Thorne ordered the searchlight to be trained on the deck of the mysterious destroyer. The beam of light cut through the gloom and illuminated a scene of utter desolation. The deck was empty of life, but scattered with debris that hinted at a violent end. Shell casings littered the steel plates, and tangled cables hung like snakes from the superstructure. There was something deeply wrong about the silence that hung over the vessel. It was not the quiet of an empty house, but the silence of a held breath waiting for a scream. The crew of the Sea Raven felt a collective urge to turn their boat around and flee back to the safety of the open ocean. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread, Elias Thorne knew he had a job to do. He selected a boarding party consisting of himself, Thomas Vance, and two other able-bodied seamen named Miller and Hayes. They lowered a small skiff into the black water and rowed across the narrow gap between the two vessels. The water was oily and stagnant, and it slapped against the hull of the skiff with a wet and slapping sound. As they drew closer to the destroyer, the smell of rust and rot became overpowering. It smelled like old blood and decay, mixed with the sharp tang of ozone. They threw a grappling hook over the rail and climbed up the side of the ghost ship. Their boots clanged loudly on the metal deck, and the sound echoed through the empty ship like a gunshot. Elias Thorne raised his lantern and swept the beam across the superstructure. The shadows seemed to dance and twist away from the light as if they were alive. The air on the deck was freezing cold, and the men shivered in their thin work clothes. Thomas Vance pointed towards the bridge of the ship, where a faint and flickering light seemed to be emanating. It was a pale green glow that pulsed with a slow and rhythmic beat. It looked like the heartbeat of a dying beast. They moved cautiously towards the bridge and stepped over coils of rope and piles of rusted metal. The ship groaned and creaked beneath their feet as if it were in pain. Every sound was amplified in the stillness, and the men found themselves whispering, as if afraid to wake something that slumbered below. Miller paused by one of the anti-aircraft guns and brushed his hand against the cold steel. He recoiled instantly and claimed that the metal felt hot to the touch. Elias Thorne ignored him and pressed forward towards the source of the eerie green light. The sense of being watched was intense and suffocating. When they reached the bridge, they found the heavy steel door hanging off its hinges. Elias Thorne stepped inside first and held his lantern high. The interior of the bridge was a wreck of shattered glass and twisted instruments. The ship wheel was still intact, but it turned slowly back and forth on its own accord. The green light was coming from the radar station in the corner of the room. The screen was glowing brightly despite the fact that the ship had no power. It showed a single blip directly in the center of the grid. The blip was pulsing in time with the green light that filled the room. Thomas Vance approached the radar screen and stared at it with wide eyes. He whispered that the position of the blip corresponded exactly to their current location, but there was nothing else on the screen. No coastline and no other ships, just the single pulsing dot in a sea of emptiness. Suddenly, the radio equipment next to the radar crackled to life. A burst of static filled the room, followed by a voice that sounded distant and distorted. It was speaking a string of numbers and coordinates that meant nothing to the salvage crew. The voice sounded wet and gurgling, as if the speaker were underwater. Elias Thorne ordered his men to back out of the bridge immediately. He had seen enough to know that this ship was not a prize to be claimed, but a curse to be avoided. As they turned to leave, the heavy steel door slammed shut in front of them with a deafening crash. Hayes tried to pull the handle, but it would not budge. The green light on the radar screen began to flash faster and brighter until it was blinding. The static on the radio grew louder, and the voice began to scream. It was a scream of pure agony and terror that tore through the minds of the men trapped in the bridge. The temperature in the room dropped so low that frost began to form on the inside of the shattered windows. The screaming from the radio was joined by other voices, hundreds of voices crying out in pain and fear. They were the voices of the crew that had died on the ship. Elias Thorne realized with horror that the ship was replaying its final moments. The green light was the light of the fires that had consumed the vessel, and the screams were the last sounds of the dying men. The walls of the bridge seemed to bleed as rust-red water began to seep from the rivets and flow down the metal. Panic seized the salvage crew as they pounded on the jammed door. Thomas Vance grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and slammed it against the steel. The noise was lost in the cacophony of screams that filled the air. Shadows began to detach themselves from the corners of the room. They were not shapeless shadows, but distinct human forms. They wore the uniforms of the United States Navy, but their faces were charred and melted. The ghosts of the dead crew were manifesting in the green light. They reached out with skeletal hands towards the living men. Elias Thorne drew his flare gun from his belt and fired a red flare into the center of the room. The brilliant red light clashed with the eerie green glow and blinded the spectral figures for a moment. In the confusion, the door suddenly swung open as if released by the shock. The men tumbled out onto the deck and scrambled towards the rail where their skiff was waiting. The entire ship was now alive with activity. Phantom sailors ran across the deck manning invisible guns and fighting unseen fires. The air was filled with the smell of burning flesh and explosive powder. They reached the rail and threw themselves into the skiff. Miller missed his footing and nearly fell into the black water, but Hayes grabbed him by the collar and hauled him in. They rowed frantically away from the cursed destroyer as the green light intensified. It now illuminated the entire hull of the ship and cast a sickly glow across the fog. The water around the ship began to boil and churn. Hands reached up from the depths, pale and bloated hands that grasped at the oars of the skiff. The sea itself was trying to claim them. Elias Thorne shouted at his men to row harder. His heart pounded in his chest like a hammer against an anvil. He looked back at the destroyer and saw the bridge where they had been trapped. Standing in the broken window was a figure wreathed in green fire. It was the captain of the dead ship. He raised a hand and pointed a finger directly at the fleeing skiff. A bolt of green lightning arced from the ship and struck the water inches from their boat. The shockwave nearly capsized them, but they kept rowing with the desperation of men fleeing hell itself. They reached the side of the Sea Raven and scrambled up the ladder. The crew on board hauled them up and looked at them with fear and confusion. Elias Thorne did not stop to explain. He ran to the wheelhouse and slammed the telegraph to full speed ahead. The engines of the tug roared to life, and the propeller churned the water into white foam. The Sea Raven surged forward and broke through the thick fog. They put distance between themselves and the glowing green nightmare, but the light did not fade. It seemed to follow them through the mist. For hours, they steamed at full speed without looking back. The fog eventually began to lift, and the familiar stars of the southern hemisphere appeared in the sky. The green glow faded into the distance until it was nothing more than a bad memory. The crew of the Sea Raven gathered on the aft deck and stared into the darkness. No one spoke a word about what they had seen. They knew that to speak of it would be to invite it back. They had trespassed on the domain of the dead and had been lucky to escape with their lives. However, the ordeal was not over. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen aboard the Sea Raven. Tools would go missing and reappear in impossible places. Wet footprints would be found on the dry deck, leading to nowhere. The radio would turn turn on by itself in the middle of the night and broadcast the sound of static and distant screaming. Elias Thorne found himself unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the charred faces of the phantom crew and the green fire that burned without heat. Thomas Vance, the young radar operator, took it the hardest. He became withdrawn and refused to look at the radar screen. He claimed that he could still see the blip following them. He said that the dead ship was not gone, but was tracking them from just below the horizon. One night, the crew woke to the sound of a splash. They rushed to the rail, but saw nothing but the dark water. Thomas Vance was gone. His bunk was empty, and his boots were left neatly by the door. They searched the ship from bow to stern, but found no trace of him. Elias Thorne knew in his heart what had happened. The ocean had claimed its due. They had escaped the trap, but they had not escaped the curse. The Sea Raven limped back to port a changed ship with a changed crew. They sold the tug shortly after and went their separate ways. None of them ever went to sea again. They took jobs on land, as far away from the ocean as they could get, but they could never wash the smell of rust and old blood from their memories. Years passed, and the story of the Sea Raven became another legend whispered in the dockside bars of the Pacific. Sailors spoke of a green light that sometimes appeared in the Iron Bottom Sound. They said that if you looked closely, you could see a destroyer burning with cold fire and a tugboat trying desperately to tow it. Elias Thorne lived out his days in a small house in the dry interior of Australia. He kept the blinds drawn and never looked at the ocean, but on quiet nights, he could still hear the static of the radio and the wet, gurgling voice calling out coordinates. The coordinates were always the same. They were the location where they had found the dead ship. Elias Thorne wrote them down in a notebook that he kept locked in a drawer. He knew that one day someone else would find that spot on the map. Someone else would see the fog roll in against the wind. Someone else would see the green light and think it was a prize waiting to be claimed. And the cycle would begin again. The dead are patient, and they have nothing but time. They wait in the dark water for the living to come to them. The notebook was found after Elias Thorne passed away in his sleep. His face was twisted in a mask of terror, as if he had seen something horrific in his final moments. The pages of the notebook were filled with the same set of numbers, written over and over again, until the paper tore. The last entry was different. It was not a number, but a sentence written in shaky handwriting. It read simply, "The lights are here." The police officer who found the book noted that the room smelled faintly of ozone and salt water. Some say that the spirit of Elias Thorne now sails with the crew of the dead ship. He is trapped forever in the green fire and forced to relive the horror of that night for eternity. Others say that the Sea Raven itself was cursed, and that anyone who stepped foot on it was marked for death. The truth is buried deep beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean. It lies in the rust and the silt and the crushing dark. It is a truth that is best left undisturbed. The Pacific is a vast and lonely place. There are thousands of miles of open water where no ship travels and no plane flies. In these empty spaces, the past is not dead. It is waiting. The ships that sank in the Great Wars are not just metal and wire. They are tombs holding the souls of men who died in violence and fear. Their energy permeates the water and stains the very fabric of reality. The lights that sailors see are not reflections of stars or bioluminescent algae. They are the lights of the dead ships calling out to the living. They are the lanterns of the lost souls searching for a way home. But there is no home for them anymore. There is only the cold deep and the eternal wait. If you are ever sailing in the southern Pacific and you see a strange fog rolling in against the wind, turn your ship around. If you see a green light pulsing on the horizon, do not investigate. Do not let curiosity lead you into the domain of the dead. For if you do, you may find yourself becoming part of the story. You may find yourself standing on a rusted deck with the smell of old blood in your nose. You may hear the static on the radio and the screams of the dying. And you may realize too late that the light is not a beacon of hope, but a lure set by the hungry ghosts of the Pacific who are lonely in the dark and want nothing more than to drag you down with them to join their crew forever. The eerie lights of the dead ships will continue to burn as long as the ocean remains. They are a reminder of the price of war and the fragility of life. They are the nightmares of history made manifest in steel and fire. So listen to the warnings of the old sailors and respect the silence of the sea. Keep your eyes on the compass and your hand on the wheel, and never look too deeply into the fog, for you never know what might be looking back at you. The mystery of the lights has never been solved by science or reason. Expeditions sent to the coordinates found in the notebook of Elias Thorne found nothing but empty ocean. The water was deep and blue and silent, but the sonar picked up strange anomalies on the sea floor, large metallic shapes that did not match the topography of the trench, shapes that looked like ships gathered in a fleet that waits for the right time to rise again. Perhaps one day the ocean will reveal its secrets. Perhaps the technology of the future will allow us to see what lies beneath the veil of the physical world. Until then, we are left with the stories of men like Elias Thorne and the crew of the Sea Raven, stories that make us shiver in our warm beds and look at the ocean with a newfound respect and fear. The line between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. It is a line drawn in salt water and mist, a line that can be crossed in an instant of bad luck or poor judgment. The dead ships of the Pacific are patrolling that line. They are the guardians of the deep and the keepers of the dark. They are watching us with eyes that have seen the other side, and they are waiting for the next ship to lose its way in the fog. So the next time you stand on the shore and look out at the endless horizon, remember this story. Remember the green fire and the silent screams. Remember that the ocean is not just water. It is a living, breathing entity with a memory as deep as its trenches. And it does not forget. It keeps what it takes. And sometimes, beneath the light of the moon, it shows us exactly what it has kept. The legend of the Eerie lights persists to this day. Modern sailors still report strange phenomena in that sector of the Pacific. Instruments malfunction and compasses spin wildly. Radios pick up old broadcasts from the 1940s, and sometimes a ship disappears without a trace, leaving only an oil slick and a few pieces of debris. The dead ships are still out there, and they are still hungry. The legacy of the war in the Pacific is etched into the geography of the ocean floor. It is a landscape of tragedy and heroism, preserved in the cold, dark water. But it is also a landscape of horror, a place where the violence of the past refuses to fade away. The lights are the manifestation of that refusal. They are the enduring spirit of the dead refusing to go quietly into the night. We may never know the full truth of what happened to the Sea Raven or the hundreds of other ships that have vanished in those waters. We can only speculate and wonder. We can only tell the stories and hope that they serve as a warning. The world is full of mysteries that defy explanation. The eerie lights of the dead ships are one of them, a mystery wrapped in fog and silence. As long as there are ships sailing the ocean, there will be stories of the supernatural. Sailors are a superstitious lot for good reason. They live their lives on the edge of the abyss, constantly at the mercy of the elements. They know that they are small and insignificant in the face of the mighty ocean. And they know that there are things out there that cannot be explained by charts or weather reports. The final thought that lingers is a chilling one. What if the lights are not just ghosts? What if they are something else entirely? Something ancient and malevolent that feeds on the energy of the dead. Something that uses the wreckage of war as a camouflage to hunt the living. The ocean is deep, and we have explored so little of it. Who knows what truly lies in the darkness, waiting for the lights to go out? We are intruders in their domain. We skim across the surface of their world, oblivious to the horrors that lurk below. But sometimes the surface breaks, and we are pulled down into the cold, down into the dark, down into the eternal embrace of the dead ships. And when that happens, we become part of the legend, part of the eerie lights that dance on the water. The lights will continue to shine, a beacon for the damned, a warning for the living. The dead ships of the Pacific are sailing forever in a circle of time, replaying their death throes for an audience of stars and ghosts. And if you listen closely, on a quiet night, you can hear them. The faint sound of steel groaning, the whisper of the waves, and the lights. the terrible, beautiful, eerie lights. So let the sea keep its secrets. Let the dead rest if they can, and let the living stay on the shore where it is safe. For the ocean is a graveyard vast and deep, and the lights are the tombstones that mark the resting places of the lost. Do not disturb them. Do not seek them out, for the dead ships are jealous of the living, and they do not like to be disturbed. The story of the sea raven ends here, but the story of the lights continues. It is a story without an end written in the language of fear and water. It is a story that will be told as long as humans venture into the unknown. A story of the thin veil between our world and the next, and the things that slip through when that veil is torn. Watch the horizon, watch the water, and beware the lights. In the silence of the night, when the wind dies down and the moon is hidden, remember the dead ships. Remember the green glow and the charred faces, and pray that you never see them for yourself. For if you do, it is already too late. The Pacific has claimed you, and you will sail with the dead forever.